A German soldier presses himself into cold French mud, listening. Somewhere ahead of him, an American rifle is firing. 8 rounds. He is counting, or so the story goes. He has been told what happens next. When the 8th round fires, the rifle's steel clip will eject itself and it will make a sound. A sharp, metallic ping, like a small bell struck once in the middle of a battlefield. That sound, he has been told, means the American in front of him is empty, defenseless. For 2 or 3 seconds, until a new clip goes in, that soldier is just a man holding a piece of dead steel. So the German waits. He listens for the ping, and when he hears it, he moves. This is one of the most famous tactical details to come out of the Second World War. It has been repeated in bars, in gun shops, in 1,000 online forums, and in at least one enormously popular war film, where the sound rings out clearly over a French rooftop during a firefight. It has been told so many times that most people assume it must be true. There is no historical evidence that it ever happened. Not weak evidence, not disputed evidence, not evidence that historians argue about over drinks. No first-hand, verifiable account from any archive in any language has ever surfaced showing a German or Japanese soldier exploiting the sound of an M1 Garand's ejecting clip to kill an American rifleman. What does exist is something quieter and in its own way far more revealing. A paper trail. German ordnance catalogs, captured weapons inventories, a rifle program launched in a state of near panic, and a production number filed away in a 14-volume set of technical binders that says more about what Germany actually thought of the M1 Garand than any battlefield legend ever could. This is that record. Before we get into it, hit subscribe. This channel exists to pull apart the stories that get repeated until they sound like fact and hand you what the documents actually say. Let's start with the myth itself, because understanding why it's wrong is the first step toward understanding what's real. The M1 Garand entered U.S. Army service in 1936, the first self-loading rifle ever adopted as a standard infantry weapon by a major power. It was designed by John Garand, a Canadian-born engineer working at Springfield Armory, and the first production model was formally proofed and function checked in the summer of 1937. Output climbed slowly at first, barely 100 rifles a day by early 1940, and it took years of factory expansion before the rifle reached every American infantryman heading overseas. By the time it did, it had quietly rewritten the math of the battlefield. It used a gas-operated action and fired 8 rounds of .3006 ammunition from a steel en-bloc clip, loaded straight down into the receiver. A trained soldier could fire all 8 rounds nearly as fast as he could pull the trigger, no bolt to work between shots. That alone gave American infantry squads a rate of fire no bolt-action army in the world could match, round for round, rifleman for rifleman. The clip system had one unavoidable byproduct. When the 8th round fired, the empty clip didn't just fall out. It was thrown clear by a spring, and the empty clip striking the receiver produced a distinct high metallic ping. It is a real sound. Anyone who has fired a Garand or watched a war film that bothered to record it accurately has heard it. The myth builds directly on top of that real mechanical fact, and that's exactly why it has survived as long as it has. The ping is true. The mechanism is true. The sound really does mean the rifle needs a new clip. Every part of the setup checks out. It's the conclusion that collapses. The story didn't need much help spreading once it existed. It moved through gun shops and shooting ranges where the sound is heard constantly on the firing line, and the temptation to attach a dramatic meaning to it is obvious. It moved through reenactment circles, where the ping is part of the sensory experience of handling the weapon. And it moved through film and television, where a single, clearly audible ping punctuating the chaos of a firefight is simply good sound design, regardless of whether it reflects anything that happened in real combat. None of that makes the story malicious. It makes it exactly the kind of detail that spreads on texture and drama rather than on evidence, the same way countless other battlefield legends have. Researchers who have gone looking for the origin of the story keep finding the same wall. Armament Research Services, a firearms and conflict analysis group that specializes in exactly this kind of investigation, examined the claim in detail and came up empty. No wartime after-action report references it. No captured German training document warns soldiers to listen for it. No official history, American, German, or Japanese, records a single documented casualty caused by it. What they found instead was an unusual and telling pattern. For every account of a veteran who swore the ping got a friend of his killed, there was another veteran from the same theater, insisting he'd never heard of any such thing happening to anyone he knew. Firearms writers who dug through decades of exchanges in American Rifleman magazine found the same split, letter after letter, one veteran countering another, going back to the early 2010s and further. And almost without exception, the version told as a first-hand account traces back one or two questions later to a story about someone else, a cousin, a buddy of a buddy, something heard secondhand, decades after the war, and repeated as though it had been witnessed directly. That pattern has a name among historians and folklorists. It's the shape a legend takes, not the shape a documented event takes, and the tactical logic falls apart almost as fast as the sourcing does. A trained Garand user could load a fresh clip and be back in action in a couple of seconds, not the extended vulnerable window the myth requires. American riflemen rarely fought as isolated individuals. They fought in squads, with other rifles covering each other, which meant an enemy soldier who charged a position the instant he heard a ping was as likely to be shot by the next man over as he was to reach his target. And underneath all of that is the simplest problem of all. A real World War II battlefield was not quiet. It was gunfire, explosions, shouted orders, engine noise, and screaming, often all at once. A single metallic click from one rifle, at the range most infantry firefights actually took place, would have been extraordinarily hard to isolate and act on in the middle of that chaos. There's also a wider tactical picture that the myth completely ignores. Comparative strength studies of American, British, and German infantry divisions in 1944 show that an American infantry division, despite being smaller overall than its German counterpart, fielded its riflemen with a semi-automatic weapon as standard issue, while a German infantry division of similar size was still built around bolt-action rifles, supplemented by a modest number of automatic weapons. The firepower gap that mattered wasn't hidden in the sound of a clip ejecting. It was sitting in plain sight in the hands of every American soldier, all day, every day, whether a single clip had just emptied or not. Waiting for a ping to catch one man reloading would have been a strange, high-risk gamble against an enemy whose entire squad already outgunned you by design. There's a final twist to the story, and it's the part that almost never makes it into the retelling. The sound wasn't a secret weakness American soldiers were desperate to hide. Some of them turned it into a weapon of their own. Veterans of the 1st Infantry Division, interviewed decades later by staff at the Fort Riley Museum, described a trick they used deliberately. A soldier would carry a spare, already empty clip in his pocket. He'd fire off a couple of rounds from his loaded rifle, then throw the empty spare against something hard, faking the ping on command, whenever he wanted an enemy head to show itself. If the myth had any real tactical value on a battlefield, it was American riflemen exploiting it against the Germans, not the other way around, and using their own initiative to do it. So if there's no German testimony, no after-action report, and no documented casualty behind this story, what did Germany actually write down about the M1 Garand? Because they did write about it, just not in the form anyone tells around a campfire. The German Army Weapons Office, the Heereswaffenamt, ran an enormous cataloging operation throughout the war for exactly this purpose. Every piece of captured enemy equipment that came into German hands in useful quantity got logged, assessed, and assigned an official designation so that ordnance depots and combat units could requisition and issue it without confusion. The system covered pistols, rifles, machine guns, artillery, even vehicles, and it was compiled into a 14-volume reference set known as the Kennblätter Fremden Geräts, the characteristic sheets for foreign equipment. It listed technical specifications, dimensions, ammunition types, and operating notes for weapons captured from every nation Germany fought. The Germans had a blunt, unsentimental term for all of this captured hardware: Bootewaffen, war booty weapons, sometimes just Fremdgerät, foreign equipment. The bureaucracy behind the term was equally blunt. The catalog wasn't organized by battlefield story or soldier testimony. It was organized the way an army organizes anything it needs to move through a supply chain. By caliber, by type, by a numbering system that let a depot clerk in occupied France requisition the same rifle a depot clerk in Poland might be issuing that same week. It is, in other words, the least romantic document imaginable. And that is exactly why it's trustworthy. Nobody was writing it to make a good story. They were writing it to keep captured guns moving through a logistics system under wartime pressure. Somewhere inside that set is the M1 Garand. The Germans gave it a formal type designation, Selbstladegewehr 251A, self-loading rifle 251, country code A for America. It sits in the same catalog alongside captured Soviet, French, and other Allied small arms, each one numbered and filed the same clinical way. It's not a story. It's a line item in a technical manual, written by an ordnance clerk doing his job. The scale of that cataloging effort tells its own story. By the end of 1944, Germany had processed more than 11 million captured rifles of all types across every front of the war, folded into logistics and reissued to second-line troops and occupation forces as the war ground on and domestic production strained to keep pace. The Garand designation isn't an isolated curiosity. It's one entry inside a much larger German bureaucratic response to running desperately short of their own equipment. Even the Japanese took the Garand seriously enough to try copying it outright, reverse engineering examples captured in the Pacific into a rifle designated the Type 5, chambered for their standard 7.7mm cartridge. It never reached meaningful production or combat use before the war ended in 1945, but the attempt itself is documented, and it's a far more concrete measure of how seriously the Axis powers rated the weapon than any second-hand story about a sound in the woods. There is one other place where German officers genuinely did put their thoughts on American weapons and tactics into writing, though it comes with its own warning label. After the war, the U.S. Army's Historical Division ran a program that had former Wehrmacht generals, including men who had commanded divisions on the Western Front, write detailed manuscripts about their own operations, working under the direction of men like Franz Halder, the former chief of the German General Staff. Thousands of these studies were produced between 1945 and the mid-1950s. They're a genuinely valuable historical resource, and some of that material fed directly into the U.S. Army's own official history of the war. But historians who study the program are candid about its limits. The earliest manuscripts were written from memory, without access to official records, by officers with every incentive to present their own performance and the war they'd just lost in the most favorable light possible. It's real German testimony. It's also testimony that has to be checked against the paper trail, not substituted for it, which is exactly the same standard we're applying to the Ping story itself. Here's where the record gets genuinely interesting, though, because it forces a correction to the more common assumption. Most people who hear that Germany tried to build its own semi-automatic rifle assume it was a direct answer to the Garand. It wasn't, not primarily. The real shock came from the East. Germany entered the war in 1939 with the bolt-action Karabiner 98K as its standard infantry rifle, a design with roots going back to the previous World War. When German forces invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, they ran directly into something they hadn't fully accounted for. Large numbers of Soviet infantrymen already carrying semi-automatic Tokarev rifles, the SVT-38 and its improved successor, the SVT-40. That encounter, not contact with American troops, is what pushed German ordnance planners into a genuine sense of urgency about their own semi-auto program. The first attempt, the Gewehr 41, was compromised before it left the drawing board. German ordnance requirements at the time included a rigid technical restriction. No gas port could be drilled through the barrel. The fear was that a hole in the barrel would weaken it and complicate field maintenance. To work around that rule, two manufacturers, Mauser and Walther, were each forced into the same awkward workaround, a complicated muzzle-mounted gas trap system instead of tapping gas directly from the barrel, the way the Garand and the Soviet Tokarev both did. Gas from the fired round was caught in a cone fitted around the muzzle and used to drive a long piston back to cycle the action. It was an ingenious solution to a problem the German army had created for itself, and it worked poorly. Fouling from the trapped propellant gas built up quickly. The mechanism was heavy and awkward to maintain in the field, and troop reports from the Eastern Front made it clear the rifle wasn't earning its weight in a soldier's kit. It was, by nearly every account, a disappointment. It took another 2 years of hard lessons on the Eastern Front and captured Soviet SVT-40 rifles studied firsthand before Walther abandoned the gas trap restriction and adopted a simpler direct gas system modeled closely on the Soviet design. That rifle, the Gewehr 43, entered production in October 1943. It was renamed the Karabiner 43 the following spring after Hitler personally reviewed reports on troop performance with the weapon. It was, by the standards of German engineering, a solid rifle. It came too late, and it came in numbers that could never matter. Total production of the G43 and K43 combined, across every manufacturer and every month of the war, was 402,713 units. That figure includes more than 53,000 sniper variants fitted with the ZF-4 telescopic sight, which is itself a telling detail. A rifle Germany couldn't build in numbers large enough to re-equip its infantry got redirected, in large part toward specialized marksman use instead. Compare that to the other side of the ledger. Springfield Armory and Winchester built roughly 4 million M1 Garands during the Second World War, with total wartime and post-war production eventually climbing past 6 million. Germany's entire semi-automatic rifle program, chasing a design idea it had first taken seriously after meeting Soviet rifles rather than American ones, produced less than a tenth of what the United States turned out of the Garand alone. Every American infantry division landing in Normandy carried the M1 as standard issue. The overwhelming majority of German infantry divisions, right through to the surrender in 1945, were still carrying the bolt-action Kar 98K their grandfathers would have recognized from the trenches of the First War. That gap is the real story. Not a soldier listening for a ping in a hedgerow, but an industrial and institutional gap so wide that it shows up clearly in the numbers alone. No dramatic anecdote required. There's one more document worth putting into the record because it comes from the American side, and it closes the loop. On January 26, 1945, with the war in Europe entering its final months, Lieutenant General George S. Patton wrote a letter on his 3rd Army letterhead to Major General Levin H. Campbell, the Army's Chief of Ordnance. In it, Patton praised the equipment his men were fighting with and opened with a single line that would outlive every campaign he ever fought. In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised. Patton wasn't a man who threw around praise casually, and he wasn't writing for public consumption. He was writing an internal assessment to the officer responsible for keeping his army supplied. That's not marketing. That's a field commander. 5 months from the end of the war, he'd spent driving deep into German territory, putting on paper what he'd watched the rifle do for 3 years, from North Africa through France and into Germany itself. Set that letter next to the catalog entry for Selbstladegewehr 251A, and next to the bare number 402,713, and the picture becomes unmistakable. This was never a story that needed a ping in the dark to be dramatic. It was a story about which side could actually build the rifle it needed, in the numbers it needed, in time to matter. Germany couldn't. America could. Everything else is folklore built on top of a true and unremarkable mechanical fact. Think about what actually sits on each side of this ledger. On one side, no soldier's name, no unit, no date, no casualty, nothing that survives contact with an archive. On the other, a clerk's designation number written into a technical binder, a production tally that can be checked against factory records on 2 continents, and a general's signature on 3rd Army letterhead. One of those is a story people wanted to be true. The other is simply what happened, whether anyone wanted it to or not. That is the difference